So my name is Daniel Ivasar. I've been doing this building brain awareness talk series. Really, it's about different topics that affect people with brain injury, and I'm very happy that Dr. Jerrod Brown agreed to do this topic and the next one. This topic is on confabulation. It's all about learning more about these kinds of issues to learn with what people are dealing with and how to improve, how to manage these issues. So, Jerrod, you can feel free to introduce yourself and take it from here.
Thank you, Dan, for having me. Hope
Thank
all
you.
of you are doing well. My name's Jerrod. If you have any questions, just interrupt anytime. Here's my email address. Reach out anytime too if you have questions about anything related to brain injury or confabulation. And more than happy to share these slides with you folks too. So just shoot me an email. If here's a brief copy of my biography. I'm a professor. I do a lot of trainings for different groups on a variety of topics. I do quite a bit of publishing and research, and I also consult on a lot of different cases, legal cases, clinical cases, sometimes with group homes, sometimes family members reach out to me and find an article I wrote and say, hey, I'd like to consult with you. My loved one is dealing with this particular issue and stuff. And currently, too, I'm working on another degree right now in nutrition. So I'm really trying to infuse nutrition, gut health, sleep intervention, circadian rhythm, inflammation, all of those topics into the world of brain injury. And the research supports it. And those are some really helpful interventions as well. And if you have questions on anything like that too, just let me know. These are my main areas of focus when I consult on cases. I've consulted on homicide cases and domestic violence, clinical cases. We won't be able to get to all of these topics today, but these are my main areas of focus. I do a lot of presenting on these topics. And when I consult on cases, I lean on these bodies of research to help dig into the case file. And it really has helped me have a more of a holistic view of the individual. These are some of my certifications. I have a lot of certifications in a variety of areas, including lots of things related to the brain. And these are my graduate certificates. And one of my graduate certificates is in traumatic brain injury. I do a lot of work in neuroscience and got some stuff in biochemistry. I'm not going to bore you with biochemistry today, but I will talk about brain injuries quite a bit. So, the goal with this first half, just kind of give you an overview of confabulation. It might be something maybe some of you have heard about, maybe you haven't heard, maybe you're experiencing this, whatever it is. This is a topic I think we all deal with on some level. We're all prone to confabulate under the wrong circumstances. But folks who have had a brain injury are more prone to confabulate, and I'll talk about why that's the case. But these are my own just professional, personal thoughts on confabulation. I've given lots and lots of talks on this. If you Google my name, you can find many, many articles I've written, lots of podcasts I've done. It's a complex topic. Anytime we're talking about anything related to memory, it's really complex and it can be very confusing. Few professionals have had advanced training in confabulation. The reason being, this topic isn't really talked a lot about in clinical programs, medical programs, criminal justice programs. So, more training education is definitely needed for professionals, caregivers, family members, and the list goes on. This is a confusing topic because of what I have on this slide. If you dig into the research, and there's literally been hundreds, if not thousands, of articles written on the topic of confabulation over the past century or more. Not all of them are obviously related to brain injuries. Some are, but a lot are related to all kinds of other disorders, disabilities, circumstances, and depending on what research article you look at, sometimes confabulation is described as a condition, a deficit, a disorder. The way I look at it, I really see it more as like a memory phenomenon or a memory error. It's not its own disorder per se, because confabulation can co-occur with so many different things. And even anyone who's interviewed, maybe by law enforcement, might be more prone to confabulate just in that interviewing session. If someone's interviewed ineffectively, that could trigger confabulation regardless if the person has any impairments or not. And again, interrupt me anytime if you want me to slow down, park the brakes, maybe clarify anything I'm saying. More than happy to do that. Lots of definitions out there about confabulation. Sometimes it's referred to as an erroneous memory. Sometimes it's referred to as an incorrect memory. Sometimes it could be a correct memory as well, but maybe it's taken out of temporal context, which is basically a fancy way of saying maybe Dan, for example, comes to me in the morning and says, "Hey, I experienced this." We later find out he's talking about something from years ago when he's thinking it might have happened to him this morning. That's an example where it's taken out of temporal context, taken out of time. That can happen as well. Confabulation can result from memories that absolutely did not occur. I've consulted on some cases where the child accused one of the parents of sexual assault. And after like big investigations, they later found out no sexual assault happened. The child was at school and might have overheard a conversation on the playground and listened to that conversation and now encoded that conversation into their brain and reported something that happened to them when in fact it didn't happen to them. It was just an overheard conversation. That's an extreme example. And there can be elements of truth in a confabulation mixed with things that are completely false. But what we do want to consider, if someone is truly confabulating, they have no intent to deceive or lie or mislead. So it is a false memory. There's many kinds of false memories. Confabulation is one. And there's no intent for the person to lie, even though it may seem like they're lying. That's where it gets even more confusing. So again, let's break it down a little bit more. It could be a completely fabricated memory that the person does not realize they're fabricating. It could be a completely inaccurate memory. It could be a partially true memory that's distorted, where it's blended with true memories and mixed with false memories. And again, taken out of temporal context, where someone reports something maybe happened to them this morning, but they're really talking about something that happened to them maybe a week ago, a month ago, years ago. So they can be completely imagined. When you study this, you want to understand the topic of reality monitoring. That is when somebody has difficulty determining, did I dream that or did I actually experience that? Sometimes people with reality monitoring deficits are going to be more fantasy prone. I've consulted on cases where the individual has been highly fantasy prone. Like they have a hard time determining what's real and what's not. Social media, this comes up a lot. It's not in the research literature a ton, but I see this in a lot of cases I've consulted on where maybe the client is just thrusted into the online world and they're really interested in like fantasy games and those kind of things. This can trigger a confabulation. And it can be drawn from personal experiences. We'll talk about that too. If someone's confabulating, the research says it's really important to dig into that person's current emotional state, social health, and sometimes it's drawn from personal experiences. So if someone's dealing with a lot of depression or loss or grief, or maybe they're going through a divorce, sometimes those stressful situations or traumatic events can play a role in confabulation development. A lot of views on confabulation. Some of them are older, some of them are newer. Some of the older research literature, some researchers say it's related to impaired memory function that contributes to that person feeling uncertain. Uncertainty, hang on to this. If the person has a high degree of uncertainty in their memory, they may be much more likely to confabulate because they don't know the answer. And sometimes they fill in the gaps in their memory with things that are not true but they don't want to tell the person that I don't understand what you're saying. I don't know the answer. So they just fill it in with something that makes sense to them. And then that memory gets encoded as fact, when in fact it might be a memory that is completely false. The belief that a response is expected. This is common in an interview. So if someone's being interviewed by law enforcement and they have a lot of fear and they're a people pleaser and they want to please people in positions of power, if someone's asking a question and they don't know the answer to, they're probably not going to say again, I don't know what you're saying. Please repeat it in a different way. They might just say something to people please. And that thing they say to them might be completely made up and they don't realize they made it up. And now their memory gets encoded with that false memory that to them feels like a real memory. Dan, I'm just going to stop there for a second, let everybody pause and breathe for a second and see what we got for thoughts and questions.
And I have a question. I'm sure other people do too. Jerrod, could we break down like so you mentioned three topics with memory, with thought, and with reality monitoring. That's an interesting one, and I've thought of those as capacities or aspects that the brain creates, and when they get injured, they don't always work well. So, um, I guess my question is, are they three different things? Reality monitoring, thought, and memory, or are they all kind of intermixed? Or how do you think about those?
You have reality monitoring where did I dream that or did I actually experience that? You
Hmm.
have source monitoring. Did I actually witness that or did I see it on the news? Those two are kind of similar but different. You have
Okay.
strategic monitoring deficits where then someone maybe with a brain injury is asked to recall something from their memory, but the way they retrieve it is not working properly. So they could miss retrieve something and then they have a partial memory, but they're embarrassed to say, I don't know the answer. So now they encode it with a different memory that mixes together with a true memory and a false memory get mixed together. That can be a recipe for confabulation. A lot of times it depends on the brain. The brain's complex and they do overlap. Executive function is a thing that overlaps with all these things. Metacognition. I'll show you a slide in a few minutes with all the different variables we need to consider with that. But reality monitoring, source monitoring, strategic monitoring, those would be three additional topics you'd want to be aware of if you really want to dig into the weeds with this topic of confabulation.
Yes, I do.
Excellent. Any other questions I can answer now?
Hello, this is Howard.
Hi, Howard.
And when you got the polytrauma cases where it's PTSD and TBI, I'm wondering how the disassociation factors in with this.
Yeah, they can. I have a slide that kind of talks to that indirectly. Disassociation, delusions, psychosis, amnesia are all variables we need to consider. And sometimes a lot of those things are related to inaccurate memory recall, memory storage. Sometimes the question comes up, how do I know if it's a confabulation or a delusion or a disassociation? It gets really, really tricky. And some of the literature says, depending on what you read, it might be impossible in some cases. Other cases, you really need to dig into that client's history. And the more diagnoses that that person has, the more trauma in their history, it does get tricky. And that is why, what I'll show you in a little bit, we really need to tackle this from a multidisciplinary standpoint. One professional can't address all of these things. So for some people with PTSD, TBI, they're going to do quite well working with a sleep specialist. Some people will do quite well working with a therapist. Some folks might need medication. Some folks might need to improve their overall nutrition health. So how do we target this? Let's look at all the consequences, all of the problem areas the person's dealing with and tackle them as much as possible, but we also want to capitalize on the client's strengths, their hobbies, their skills, their interests, have person-centered planning, use motivational interviewing, utilize trauma-informed care practices. Howard, did that answer your question or did that get it even more murky?
No, it hits it. It just said the polytraumas, it gets complicated to differentiate too.
Yeah, we know I give lots of talks on this. We know, unfortunately, PTSD, TBI co-occur a lot. And depending on the type of brain injury, that situation can cause PTSD. But then on top of that, if someone's got TBI or PTSD alone, they're dealing with sleep issues almost always. If you got both those going on, you absolutely got sleep issues. I've consulted on numerous cases too where someone has TBI, PTSD, and they're dealing with a lot of internal distress, and maybe they have poor coping skills. And what happens? They might smoke cigarettes, use energy drinks, eat a lot of high energy dense foods loaded with salts and sugars. That's just pouring fuel on the fire. So many moving parts with the body and brain when we're talking about TBI and PTSD together. And then with the polytrauma, again, are we talking about a higher adverse childhood experiences score too, where maybe there's higher incidence of early childhood trauma? Then on top of that, now we have fractured attachment patterns. So a lot of moving parts, and that's why it's so important to work with consultants and people that understand these topics when developing a really holistic, integrative goal plan.
I've met a lot of people with brain injury that the PTSD comes after the brain injury because of how they are treated, mistreated, neglected, and kind of left on their own to fend for themselves. And I guess the only distinction there is the PTSD from the brain injury. They could have been supported better once they had a brain injury, and that's a big problem too. It sort of aggravates and adds over the years. It gets worse and worse.
You want to be aware of health disparities and social determinants of health there, and even medical trauma in some cases, and
Yeah,
stigma and marginalization and shame. I mean, those are all real things that come up in the TBI literature, and I see it frequently on various cases I've consulted on over the years.
yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks, folks. Anything else before I move on? So again, there's thousands of articles on confabulation related topics. So this is again another reason why this topic gets confusing, because depending on what study you look at, this is how it's described in the research literature. And this is not an all-encompassing list. Some studies refer to confabulation as absurd stories. Confabulations can be very believable, but completely false. They can come off as very bizarre, where it seems like it's delusional in nature. That there's some literature in the schizophrenia world that talks about confabulations and delusions. It's almost impossible to differentiate between the two. Someone who confabulates is going to typically present with a high degree of confidence what they're saying is accurate, and they may have a behavioral response to it. They may cry or laugh or have emotions, even though the memory is completely false. The brain can't make sense if it's true or not. It can be very detailed. It could come off as very, very disorganized. Long-term confabulation is less common. It does happen. Most confabulations are going to be short-term in nature. So they're not going to like continue on and on and on. If someone confabulates, most of the time, again, it's not always going to be 100%. They're not going to hang on to that same story all the time. But I've seen cases where that could happen. It just depends on so many factors. Embarrassment plays a role. Again, if the person does not know the answer to something and they don't want to look stupid in their mind, they're going to fill something in their memory. They're going to backfill their memory with something they don't realize maybe they just made up, even though to them it feels very real and plausible. But after you dig into it, you find out, what the heck's this person talking about? Are they lying to me? They just made up a complete false story. But again, no intent to deceive. Overlapping terminology continuing to get even more complicated. This is the big one. It's been referred to as honest lying, which is kind of fascinating. Again, the person's not lying, they feel honest about it. Imagination inflation. So this is an example I see a lot. Prior to the brain injury, the person was able to hold a job. They were very successful in their relationship. After the brain injury, they couldn't hold the job. And maybe they had a lot of relationship breakdowns and they couldn't parent as effectively and they're going through a divorce. This is kind of imagination inflation. I've seen this in a few cases where the person is beefing up their self-esteem because they're dealing with such low levels of self-esteem and shame because they're not able to perform at that same level after the brain injury. And they start making up all these stories, but their brain can't make sense of what's true and what's not. So everything gets encoded as real. And now the person almost comes off as like they're bragging.
Hold
This
on
is
one second, Jerry. Sorry. Can everyone mute themselves?
Are you able to mute folks on your end, Dan?
I cannot mute people, except for myself.
Let me see if I can mute here. There we go. Figured it out. Okay, perfect. So
Yeah, you're the host. Yeah, cool. Thank you.
a lot again packed in here, but if you go through tons of studies, these are overlapping terms. These would be good search terms for all of you to be aware of too. If you want to continue to read about it, you could basically type in confabulation and honest lying or confabulation, imagination, inflation. You'll find good articles and things to read on that.
Can we go back to the point you were making before that side discussion? So I've always wondered why there is such a high level of confidence when they have these memories or these thoughts. And do you think it's always the case that it's a beefing up, or do you think it's just for them that is real? Because the confidence thing, I've observed that a number of times, and it seems like I don't even have confidence in reality. So why do they have such confidence in these?
No, it doesn't always have to be they're kind of trying to boost up their self-esteem. That's one aspect of it. And
Uh,
it might be situational. It might be out of embarrassment. It might be out of uncertainty. It might be just that's kind of how they're wired in their temperament. And
okay.
again, their brain has a hard time making sense of what's real, what's not in some cases. And to someone that maybe has already underlying memory problems or a little confusion, what makes sense to them may not make sense to other people. So in some cases too, you might see this. Maybe it's a confabulation, but the person gets mislabeled as being delusional when in fact they're not delusional. They think they're in complete reality, and that false memory seems very plausible as well, even though to the rest of the world, it could come off maybe as a lie. It could come off as malingering in some cases in forensic settings, or it could come off as a delusion. So I'll show you guys some strategies and ways to dig into this, kind of how we maybe start pulling this apart. Again, it's not going to be a perfect science, it gets tricky. Sometimes the individual may need to be referred to a neurologist or a neuropsychologist for more testing or other kinds of professionals for more of a holistic kind of evaluation on what's going on. Other characteristics, verbal confabulation is going to be more common. So we're verbally saying a story or something. But confabulation can also come out as nonverbal. Some studies that have found that confabulations can actually come out in drawings. So they've learned that children may be prone to this depending on a number of circumstances. The person can present as confident and coherent, or it could again look like a delusion, or they're just not in reality whatsoever. Personality factors need to be taken into account. What is the person's mood state like? What is their level maybe of depression? Are they dealing with some grief and loss issues? Are they a huge introvert and they are just terrified to talk in front of other people or being interviewed by other people? That is another variable that could potentially trigger this.
Can you, Olivia, can you mute yourself, or Jared, if you can mute Olivia? There's a sound that keeps coming in. A
Yeah.
funny sound. Thank you. When you say not being in reality, what does that mean, or how do you interpret what that means, and also how can the people around a person who's not in reality help that person?
When we do the next talk in January, we'll be talking about anosognosia, and we're going to
Yeah.
talk a lot about that. But if someone is truly not in reality, could they be dealing with psychosis? Could they be dealing with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or schizoaffective disorder or something on that spectrum? That could be a situation. I've consulted in many, many cases where that's been an issue.
Uh-huh.
Interestingly, on a side note, I think there's a study out there. Don't quote me. I don't know I think it's 10 to 15% of folks with schizophrenia have histories of TBI, which is significantly higher than the general population. So, what role does that play in this? It's definitely a variable. And there's plenty of research that does show that a TBI could contribute to more psychotic behaviors and not being in reality and coming off as delusional like, and the person just does not know what's real and what's not, but to them they absolutely believe what they're saying is true. So you'll see this in clients, and we'll talk about this in January, anosognosia. That could be a factor where the client truly does not believe they have a brain injury. And
Yeah.
that's anosognosia. If that person does not believe they have a brain injury, what's going to happen? They're not going to stay medication compliant, because why in the world would they be on medications if they don't need them? Why would they listen to their family? They're going to think their family's out to get them. That drives up the bus with suspiciousness, paranoia, and unfortunately, relationship breakdowns, and unfortunately, a recipe for aggression in some cases, the research says. So we'll get a lot deeper in the weeds with that reality piece and delusions and psychosis, but it can be a factor in some of these cases. Stress does not help, obviously. So what do we do to target this? Well, we try to help learn new stress management strategies, reduce depression. If the person has a drug or alcohol problem, helping them stay sober. I mean, the list goes on, but this is not an all-encompassing list, but these are some of the big ones that come up in the research literature too. What are the potential causes, contributing factors, drivers for confabulation? Memory issues. Now, however, you'll find plenty of studies that say there's plenty of examples of people confabulating who have no memory problems, executive function impairments, frontal lobe damage. So someone got hit in the head and their frontal lobes, prefrontal cortex. Other kinds of cognitive impairments. So maybe there's working memory issues, cognitive inflexibility problems, metacognitive deficits. Here's the reality monitoring and source monitoring we spoke about before. Deficits in autobiographical memory. This is basically, do you remember your last birthday party? Do you remember when you got married? Do you remember the birth of your child? Do you remember when you graduated from high school or college? That's the memory of self. People have deficits in this area. They may forget key moments in their life that make them who they are. I spoke about this before, but in some cases, it could be a means to preserve a sense of self-identity or self-esteem. So again, maybe before the injury, the person was able to work and did great with money management or could drive a car. After the brain injury, maybe they couldn't hold a job. Maybe they can't do money management. Maybe they can't drive a car anymore. High level of confusion, memory distrust. Dan, you and I are walking down the street. We witness a car accident. We're interviewed by law enforcement. I don't trust my memory. I know you, Dan, having a wonderful memory, so I am going to go by what you say and just mimic that and repeat that. That's memory distrust at kind of a practical level. High levels of stress during interviews, typically during like a legal interview or someone's cross-examined or in an interrogation setting, something like that. This is not an all-encompassing list. These are some of the big variables. And usually it's a combination of factors. And sometimes people can confabulate when none of these factors are at play. Causes, again, brain damage, executive function, memory issues, and even issues in the area of the social realm. Here's anosognosia that we'll talk about in January. Here's how you spell it. This is the number one reason why people are not successful in treatment, the research says. This is very common among folks with a head injury. It's very common among people with schizophrenia, bipolar, neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer's, dementia, Parkinson's, and the list goes on. A false claim is a key feature of confabulation. Again, it may be false, but the person does not know it's false. There's a lot of overlap between confabulation, delusions, and anosognosia. So if you really want to understand this topic too, learn about the basics of a delusion and anosognosia. Many disorders where we see elevated levels of confabulation. This is a very small list. Traumatic brain injury is talked about frequently. Even chronic alcohol consumption can trigger confabulations. It's very common too among folks with schizophrenia and even people with tumors in their brain. This is more rare, but it happens. Spontaneous confabulations can happen unprovoked, unpromoted. You're going to see more of it in neurodegenerative disorders. This is more common, provoked confabulation. This is in response to being asked a question. It could be in an interview. It could be you're sitting in the classroom, the professor calls on you and you don't know the answer, you're terrified, and you backfill your memory with something, and that could trigger a confabulation. Verbally based, again, are more common. People can have behavioral reactions to confabulation. They can literally cry and have emotions because, again, that false memory, the brain doesn't really pick up that it's false. They're going to think it's absolutely real. A lot of times I get this question, so I've decided to add it to all my trainings now. What's the difference between misremembering and confabulation? It can seem very similar, but misremembering is the distortion of retained information. Confabulation is an entirely fabricated memory. Doesn't always, some authors say, again, it's not going to be entirely fabricated. It could be a mixture of some true and some false. But this is the best way to determine or describe the differences between misremembering and confabulation. Dan, before I get to this last section on just all the interventions, anything else folks want to talk about on those other sections?
This is Howard. One of my colleagues did his PhD on malingering and corrections. And I'm wondering if sometimes some of these folks with TBIs and PTSD and this confabulation is not understood. They see them as malingering.
Sure could be. There's an article I wrote with my colleague several years ago. You can Google it, and it's on confabulation within confinement settings. And we talk about that in there, that sometimes on the surface, confabulation and malingering could look similar, but there's no secondary gain when someone's confabulating. Malingering is always secondary gain. So you're going to see higher rates of malingering in forensic settings, prison settings, even military. Sometimes folks in the military, and this comes up in the research literature, may say something that's not true to think they're going to get out of military deployment. That comes up. So malingering, person knows exactly what they're doing. They're making up a story for secondary gain. Confabulation, no intent to deceive.
Thank you for that distinction, because yeah, the intent to deceive is a big part of um, why someone would basically lie. But I just want to say that I come at this from the brain injured perspective, and although I don't have confabulation, I have negative attribution bias, and my wife and family say I don't trust anyone or give no one the benefit of the doubt, and it's because in my experiences and with other brain injured people that I've spoken to, we have very specific internal injuries or problems, or it's just awareness of what is broken in us in strange ways, and it's hard to put it into words. And that's the thing that I often see people being accused of malingering because people can't make sense of it. They don't have that brain injury, they're not in that person's mind. And that's the biggest problem I see with malingering, that they can't just believe or take the brain injured person at their word. And so I think that could cross over into confabulation. I've met people with confabulation and spoken to them about it, but the malingering is what we get accused of more often because people can't make sense of the strange internal states that come with brain injury. So I don't know if that helps, but I felt like I need to say that.
Dan, thanks for saying that. I think all caregivers need to learn about this topic because I think it can help have more patience, more understanding, more curiosity, and more compassion too. And we can't go wrong there, I think, having those approaches.
Yeah, the curiosity is a huge part because I know from my experiences of what I injured, then I can speak to another brain injured person, and when they're describing something very clearly to them, and you just give them the benefit of the doubt and curiosity, it also helps to so if this is what you're dealing with, what do we do next, or how do you deal with it? That because that's the approach I take. How do you deal with this to manage and hopefully, improve or at least address the issue? Thanks.
Um, I have a question, Olivia.
Hi,
Yeah, yeah,
Olivia.
well, yeah.
So, I went last week to the zoo and I was talking to one of the other friends in the conversation. And so she told me, um, I had a, I got it right here. She told me what it was. Oh, it was what is it? Man. So I had a medical condition. When I was 3 years old, I had chicken pox, and then I was in a coma for 2 weeks. I had seizures, all this stuff, right? But she told me it wasn't a TBI, but she said it was a brain. Oh man, where is it at? It's not a TBI, but there's another word for it. Let me see if I can find it. Oh, yeah, here it is. It's called. Oh, no, this is not it. But anyway, there's another word for it.
Is
And
it acquired brain injury?
yeah, that's it. That's
Yeah.
it. So I can use that now because when I was in school in 1967, I think was, they evaluated me and they put me as a mental retardation. And I have the documents that they put me that. So, and then all this time, they told my parents that I was going to be successful. I was never successful. And so then DVR evaluated me in 2007, and they told me I had a cognitive disability. Is that the same?
Thank you for sharing that. And I'm sorry you've had to deal with all of that. That's a lot. Thanks for sharing
Yeah.
that with all of us. But
Oh, thank you.
everyone with an acquired brain injury or a traumatic brain injury is probably going to have some level of cognitive deficits. It could be very minor. Maybe someone's a little forgetful here and there, or they have a hard time staying focused. So it looks like attention issues. Cognitive deficits are the hallmark. So that could be executive function impairments, self-regulation deficits. Those really drive the bus with day-to-day behavior. And day-to-day behavior is called adaptive functioning or functional skills, basically independent living skills, money management, time management, holding a job, medication management, things like that. So anyone that's dealing with any of that, making sure providers that you have really understand those topics. And the research really leans to the fact that skills building and psychiatric rehabilitation are very important. Those are basically skills or people that teach skills, coaching, modeling, teaching, role playing, and you're learning practical skills that can help improve day to day life and not just learning them at your home, but then how do you apply it on the job or if someone drives or takes the bus? You have to make sure the skills are generalizable. You can't just learn them in one setting. That's why a lot of therapists need training in TBI because sometimes therapists will work with someone who has a TBI, and in that office setting, the person has mastered the skill, but the minute they leave that office, they have a hard time transferring the skill to other parts of their life. And that's where skills workers come in. All are very important, but they got to work as a team.
Mm. Yeah, when he evaluated me, woo, it's just like the whole jar just opened up. And but it was really interesting. Every so that point when I was in the hospital, my whole brain was just fried. They put my mom told me they put what is it called? Oh, ice on the body, with the sheet, and then they put the ice there because my fever was just, and I was having epilepsy, it was just for that whole period because the brain was just frying for 2 weeks because of the high temperature. But after that, I started using my left hand, for drinks, mostly for drinks, holding ice cream, things like that. And all my teachers and my mom say, "Why are you using your left hand?" I go, "Mom, I don't know." And then when I was evaluated in 2007, I had a coffee cup, and the therapist goes, "What, are you left-handed?" I said, "No." I said, "I'm right-handed." He goes, "Well, why are you using your left?" I said, "I've been doing this for the whole of my lifetime." And then he started doing evaluating on me, took 2 days, and it goes, whoa. And he found, when he was doing his evaluation, he found out where the damage was. It was on the right side of the brain. And he goes, "You have very severe trauma to your brain." So I'm just, it just overwhelms me. But when you start my brain, it's just like, it's like a different person. But just a, FYI. But thank you again.
Yeah,
Thanks for
neuroplasticity
sharing.
comes to mind. We really want to learn about that topic too, neuroplasticity. Maybe that's something we could do in the future, Dan, or something. How the brain kind of rewires or maybe gets new connections and compensates. And the brain's amazing. And the more we can put good things into it, the better off we're going to be with recovery.
Is there a question, Alex? You have a hand raised, and if not, no worries. We'll.
Yes, there is. And I apologize for the absolutely disgustingly comedic timing of that telemarketer that called the first time I raised my hand.
Oh, is that what that was? Yeah, no
Yes,
worries.
I'm so sorry about that, you
No
all.
worries.
I just
Yeah,
wanted to make
is it Alexis?
Yes, Alexis, thank you.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well. I wanted to say, I think one of the things that has made it really difficult for me is, and I'm someone who is like, ooh, I chronically don't like to tell lies, which means if I say something I don't know, I really, really don't mean it, or I'll just completely lock up and can't say anything at all. And the person will be looking at me like, talk, talk, talk. And it's because I don't have an answer for you because I'm wired weird and I might full blown start going into shakes. But so when in the moments when I say something that I really didn't know, it really truly is beyond me. And I have struggled with this dichotomy with the people in my environment prior to meeting the brain network, my support group before I had them to be able to explain things better. Um, it was kind of like they were aware that there was something wrong enough with me to where they could criticize my lack of functionality. But at the same time, though, they were still trying to hold me to a standard of functionality that I couldn't reach. And so it's like they'll tell me, when we talk about malingering and confabulation, you can't have a person first accusing you of malingering about the issue that you're having and the problem that you're facing, but then also turning around and saying, hey, you're not doing well enough. You're not doing good enough. And so I was finding that the same people who were telling me that I'm not functioning well enough were also telling me that I'm malingering about how bad I'm doing. And after a while, I think even in this very conversation is the moment I realized those people don't realize they're contradicting themselves. If I'm malingering, telling you I'm not doing good, but you're also standing over there telling me I'm not doing good. You're the person who has the unrealistic expectation of the brain injured person to be doing what you want them to do. And I'm starting to wonder if maybe my moments of confabulation wouldn't be so bad if people would stop holding me to that standard.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It sounds traumatic. I mean, that is a form of trauma, and that is the exact opposite of trauma-informed care practices. You never go to a client and tell them you're not doing good enough or try harder. There's a different way to approach it. You got to empower people. You got to be kind, calm, patient, curious, and motivating. I think that's my opinion.
Yeah.
And
Also,
yeah,
the chat. There's someone in Michelle is in the chat. She had something to.
Oh, I will read Michelle's question next, and I just want to say that in response to what you said, I think so two thoughts that dichotomy of something working versus the opposite. I've had that and I've seen that a lot. I think of it as an injured part of our brain. Either it's like hyperactive or off, and it's really weird. I know what you're talking about. And the other thing is that the misunderstanding with brain injury is huge. And in these talks, I've been able to capture a few good discussions about this. A while back, Dr. Karen McAvoy, she said the people look at it, they either get, and I can't remember her exact words, but she said they either get punitive or like curious and compassionate. And for some reason, I have seen and experienced when people don't understand what you're dealing with, they get exactly like you said, like they get judgy or they get like angry at you for not being able to do the thing that if they understood what you were dealing with, hopefully they wouldn't be like that. But I think that the goal is to get them to understand because yeah, it's really aggravating. It's really makes it so much worse. And it's her word was punitive, and I remember thinking that's such a perfect word for it because it's like they think you need to be able to do it or you're I don't know what they're thinking, but they people get like that when people have the brain injury problems. It makes it so much harder.
I agree.
Yeah.
thank you,
Michelle
folks. Great discussions.
Michelle asked a question, and I'll read her question. Basically, do people share their confabulation issues up front? And she has with her memories and her interaction with her family and her dreams, she has confabulation, but her family will correct her or help her recognize that these things did not exist, but she shares her confabulation issues up front. And I guess that goes into a question of how do you interact with other people to let them know if you have this.
Well, if you were sharing your confabulations up front and you said, "Hey, I'm confabulating," I don't know if that was confabulation because you're not going to know it's confabulation. That's where it gets a little tricky.
But
When
if you have
someone,
your family correcting you over the years, then you can see that you can have that meta level of recognizing that this issue exists in you. I believe that's her case. But yeah, it is tricky and it's super complicated.
it
Yeah.
depends on how the family approaches it. If good, kind, loving relationship, you trust the family and the family gives little gentle nudges, you said this, but I don't know if that's true. It depends on how the person reacts too, because sometimes, depending on the reaction of the loved ones, if they come in hot and heavy and they're pointing the fingers, that can just ingrain that confabulation and get it deeper into the memory where it just gets so solidified, you're not ever probably going to be able to unravel that false memory from a true memory. You talked
Right.
about what do we do about it with I'll show you some slides in just a few minutes on that to give you a couple of things just to think about.
Let's talk about how to improve, manage strategies. Yeah.
Jerrod, this is Howard. If you could just speak to the law enforcement and the court implications of some of our clients coping with this, and the courts, are they addressing this in sentencing when they see that the TBI is a factor?
With confabulation you're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Because,
well, that's where I do most of my work is the legal forensic realm. So Howard, send me an email. I'll send you a bunch of links to articles I've written on the very topic and podcast. And confabulation could contribute to false confessions, wrongful alibis, wrongful imprisonment, even eyewitness testimony issues. So it has significant implications for the legal arena. Worst case scenario, someone admits to a crime they did not commit and they're imprisoned. There are documented cases of that. When you study confabulation within the context of the legal criminal justice system, you want to understand suggestibility, gullibility, naivete, acquiescence, and a topic called credulity. Again, send me an email. I can send you stuff on all of that, but it can contribute to miscarriages of justice. I do a lot of trainings for criminal justice professionals on the topic of confabulation. Most of them have never heard of the topic. So that's a problem. We need more training on that. And what I'll say about TBI, half of people or more in prison have a history of TBI. So defense attorneys who represent criminal defendants, 50% of your clients probably have an undiagnosed TBI or more. That number goes up when we're talking about domestic violence, homeless outreach settings, people with severe drug problems, people that have very violent histories and long histories of victimization as well. So it's common, unfortunately.
What was the word you used? The last one you were listing things to Howard.
Fragility.
How do you
Fragility.
spell it?
I think it's CREDULITY. Fragility. I think so. Basically, it's the willingness to accept anything that's being said to them, regardless of the evidence. You'll find it in the intellectual and developmental disability literature, a little bit in fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, but it is something you're going to want to be aware of with brain injuries, and it's a close cousin to being gullible and naive as well.
I'll email you for those articles as well. Yeah, thanks for sharing all the detail.
Yeah, you bet. All right, let's take a look here. Treatment. It is imperative to understand this topic within treatment. Doesn't matter if it's medical treatment, if it's psychiatric, behavioral, whatever it is. Because if we don't take into account confabulation in treatment, it can have significant implications for day-to-day functioning, which is adaptive functioning. If you break down adaptive functioning, if you look at the DSM-5 TR, social skills, practical skills, and conceptual skills are the three components of adaptive functioning. Adaptive functioning is basically how you live independently without supports. Interventions, lots of research on this. I wish we had a full day to go through all this stuff, but I'll give you a snapshot. If anybody is dealing with these issues on this slide, target the cognitive impairment. So if someone has executive function impairments, you work with an executive function coach. You work with a therapist who has training in executive function. You strengthen executive function. That could be strengthening time management abilities, becoming more organized, more planful. You're working with a rehabilitation specialist who understands cognitive rehabilitation. Maybe you're working with someone who can do working memory training or neural feedback. The list goes on and on. How do we start addressing it? Well, we learn about this. We stay current on the research. You want to fact check and verify information. You don't want to come off as saying, hey, I never believe what you say. But if that person has a long history of confabulation, it's important to fact check, verify. You seek out collateral informants and records. So this is kind of for the professionals. So looking at other behavioral patterns, records, talking to family members if appropriate. The individual may benefit from getting a referral to a neuropsychologist for more testing. You want to review multiple data sources. I've consulted a case I recently consulted on. It was a confabulation case, and they sent me all kinds of records to review and video test them, all kinds of stuff. So I reviewed everything thoroughly. You want to look at all data sources. The person may require more testing. If it's a professional, if you suspect confabulation, maybe document it in the case file. This person appears or looks like they are confabulating. I consult with your team, implement fact-checking procedures, clarify, verify statements. These are all basic things. These are things from articles I've written. Establish partnerships, hire consultants, work with other people who understand this. During an intake session, if you're whatever role you play a professional, maybe start infusing different questions into your intake to really start learning about this process. Develop more training opportunities, have in-service trainings for your organization, become confabulation informed. You can't go wrong if it's with folks with TBI or whatever population you work with. A misunderstanding of confabulation on the part of the professional can lead to breakdowns in that relationship, the therapeutic relationship. So it's imperative for professionals to get training in this because some of you have highlighted this already. If that professional doesn't understand confabulation, what are they going to think? Oh, they're malingering, they're lying, they're making up stories. If you can absolutely train professionals on this, professionals will be in a better position to approach the client in a much more kind, compassionate, and curiosity-based manner. This can compromise clinical decision making. If you Google my name and type in client confabulation, I wrote an article for the American Counseling Association that's geared toward therapists. What happens if a client confabulates during an assessment? They can be misdiagnosed with something they don't have. They could be underdiagnosed with something they should have. If they go to their psychiatrist, the psychiatrist doesn't understand confabulation, what could happen? They could be over medicated for something they don't have, or they could be under medicated for something they do need medications on. Other things, lots of things I just underlined in here. And as we wrap up, and I'll stick around too for questions again. This is complex. I'm throwing a ton at you. This is a good starting point, but we got a long way to go if we want to really all become confabulation informed. And when we're talking about this within the co-occurring brain injury arena, it gets even a little more complicated. So if you want some resources on these topics again, just shoot me an email. I have lots of podcasts, lots of articles. I'm more than happy to share with you.
You discussed professional approach, but what about if it's a loved one or somebody that you live with? I've observed my in-laws as my mother-in-law has confabulation now. What's best for living with and supporting a loved one that has confabulation?
Almost everything I said about the professional could be applied to the caregiver. Obviously, the caregiver is not diagnosing, but the more the caregiver can just be educated about these topics, that's number one. Maybe forming a support group, an education group, if there are brain injury alliances out there, nonprofits, starting to offer a 1 hour training on this just to caregivers. Once caregivers can learn this topic, the light bulb goes on. And then the caregiver, in a lot of cases, says, okay, that makes a lot of sense. I felt like, something wasn't right here. It didn't feel like exact lying. Now I have a name to put to it. Now they can approach the person in a much kinder, softer manner and not come in guns blazing and saying, you're lying to me. So taking it slow, patient, kind, calm, curious. And we know too, folks with a brain injury have information processing deficit. So the last thing we want to do is talk really fast, really elevated. And if someone does that, what happens? The brain shuts down, not going to take in any information. And then there's more conflict and people are arguing and yelling at each other. And that's not helpful.
In the case of if somebody has a false memory or wants to go to an event, maybe that happened 10 years earlier, is it worth trying to go with them? Is it worth trying to engage in the activity with them? Or because I see that as better than arguing with them that it doesn't exist.
That gets tricky, and you don't want to reinforce it, but maybe do a lot more listening than correcting. Hearing the story, maybe there's some truth to the story. Remember, false memories, real memories can get intertwined with each other. So if you're hearing little themes that emerge in the false memory, that can be a path to go down. So do a lot more listening, empathetic listening, trauma informed kind of care approaches. That can be very helpful. Then the person might be more likely to open up more and share even more. And that can open up the door to maybe some more avenues for healing and collaboration and maybe some collective problem solving.
This is Ben. Jerrod, I've listened to your couple trainings and I've taken a couple things home with me. My brother played football for Mankato State, and he's currently friends with a lot of NFL players. He plays video games with them, and I've actually shared a couple things with him that kind of related. If you have anything on the CTE, traumatic brain injury, related to that, one of those NFL players was kind of curious of what my brother was saying about the ADHD relation. If you have anything that's correlated to that, I'd appreciate if I could send you an email. Because he definitely my brother had a concussion, was basically couldn't see, had a sat out his sophomore year in high school. I had a couple concussions as well. And so that correlation between ADHD and maybe some symptoms of that, or some relation, I think were very fascinating for him. So he shared that on his video game chat, and they were kind of curious about it. So if you have anything, I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, the research on that, yep, send me an email, says that if someone has ADHD that's untreated and unmanaged, that may be a risk factor for a brain injury, which makes sense because they're going to be more impulsive and maybe not being able to be aware of their surroundings. But then after the brain injury, there's a whole line of research literature that says post brain injury, someone can absolutely develop symptoms that look like ADHD without a doubt, inattentiveness, concentration issues, hyperactivity. So finding providers who understand both ADHD and TBI is going to be very important as well.
Yeah, and I think that was when I said that, my brother was like, "That's very, very interesting." So, yeah, when I picked that up the last training that you had, I thought about that on the way home. I was like, should I bring this back to Thanksgiving or not? But very, very interesting stuff. I'll send you an email for sure.
Thank you.
I appreciate that discussion too. And thanks, Ben, and thanks, Jerrod, because I think of the brain injury part as injury to brain systems, brain capacities, and I've actually met and know people coincidentally I knew them before their brain injuries, and I met and got to know them after, and those two people describe injury to attention, and they kept going to doctors, kept going to places where it gets addressed as ADHD, but it isn't, because it's injury to the processes of attention. We have some talks in here that are about the actual attention systems, because there are processes in the brain, and when they get injured, it looks like ADHD, or ADHD is popular enough that it kind of makes it seem that way. But I do think it's very different. And yeah, I don't know how to treat it, obviously, but I think just to recognize that is brain injury centric. So yeah, thanks.
I had a question. So I was, diagnosed with ADHD. So I saw a psychiatrist at my clinic and he gave me medication, but I did the follow-up and my doctor says, "How's it going?" I said, "It's just like eating candy." So when we talked to the psychiatrist, he says, your injury is so severe that the medicine that I was giving you, it's no good. So he said, we can try another one. If not, you can live with it. And so I just live with it because I didn't want to, my organs to start failing or get, really bad. So I just left it like that. But like my brain, it's like a squirrel on the wheel. It just goes. And when I'm tired, then I go to sleep. But if not, I can be up 24 hours, so I know my limits now, but that is horrible for my brain to go through so much. And I just get so hyper. I just like, I could run 24 hours around the world, but I just really appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, a couple things to think about with what you said. I'm not giving any medical advice, but think of what the research says. Circadian rhythm misalignment is very common among folks with a TBI. I'm doing a training next Monday on circadian rhythm misalignment for a group of attorneys. I can get any of you in for free if you send me an email. I have a code. It's online. The gut plays a huge role in this. There's lots of research now that says that head injuries can impact gut functioning. So if you want to improve brain functioning, help improve the gut, you might do well looking at research literature about inflammation, sugar reduction, improved nutritional habits. And that's why, again, I'm really a big fan of integrative holistic approaches because there's strong research for the use of nutritional interventions with folks that have TBIs as well. So working with healthcare providers who understand those topics, that can provide additional avenues for health and wellness and healing.
Stacy, do you have a question?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Brown. I was wondering, this idea of confabulation as it relates to dissociative identity disorder. I know that not many people are actually diagnosed with that, or what we used to call multiple personality disorder. But I was just wondering, when you start integrating those personalities, how do you draw the line between confabulation and the memories of one personality versus another becoming skewed?
It'd be almost impossible in some cases. So
Yeah.
look, you guys, I'm sure a lot of you like the false memory syndrome, all that debacle, and that can be a tricky situation. So you want to look into that research. What happens if somebody goes to a therapist and the therapist isn't trained in this and uses hypnosis or guided imagery and then reinforces all those beliefs?
Mm.
The client confabulation article I wrote on that talks a little bit about that. I think that'll indirectly relate to what you're saying as well.
Okay.
I love Elizabeth Loftus' work. If you're familiar with her, like the misinformation effect and those kind of things, you might want to look at some of her work. She's kind of like the world-renowned expert in some of these things.
Okay.
It gets so tricky when we're talking about that, but it is a we have to be aware of. And therapists need to be trained in this because they have to try to stay neutral in some cases. I know it's hard because therapists wear the hat of empathy and kindness, compassion, which is so important, but we don't want to reinforce these memories too, especially in cases where like there's legal stuff going on and the person's being interviewed, there's false allegations of abuse coming up, and how do you know it's false or how do you know it's not? It's tricky, and I'm not gonna lie, consulting on cases, it's hard. How do you know 100% certainty is that real or not? Some cases you don't.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yes, sadly, as I've observed this in other people, I wasn't lucky to have a brain injury, but in my head and in my mind and with my brain and my mind, I spent a lot of time trying to distinguish different things. I realized I can't trust my judgment. But when you're on the outside observing it, it can definitely be harder or impossible. I like the holistic approach, and I like looking at how to think of what the person's intention and kind of a record. Because if you have a brain injury problem, often it lingers and stays with you and may dominate many things. So that might be a helpful approach because certain core problems a brain injured person has will continue. They will continue to have unless it gets treated and worked on, and that's a hard process. And thank you very much. This has been really informative.
Oh, absolutely. No,
Yeah.
yeah, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it. Dan, thanks for lining this up, and feel free to share my email, folks, and I will be more than happy to share any resources I have with you, including the slides today.